Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, College Football Week 5, and what a slate of games we have on tap for you today. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague, the one, the only, Payne Insider. And Payne, it's about to get real in college football, kicking off conference play in earnest with some marquee matchups this Saturday.
Looking forward to it, and we've actually got a bevy of games that we're going to break down, some a little bit deeper than others, but I looked at the list this week. How many games is it? 7 or 8?
Monumental undertaking, let's put it that way, and we have a ton of ground to cover. Obviously, conference play, very good to us last weekend. A game we probably should have won outright with the Oregon State Beavers, but cashing tickets is the name of the game. They got there +7 despite a -4 turnover differential, and I got to ask you, USC has become one of the most polarizing teams in college football. I'm curious to get Brad's take when we talk to him in a little bit, but when you look at the Trojans' full body of work, suffice to say that this is a top 10 team like they're being billed, or whereabouts do you guys have them rated in the grand scheme of things?
I think right now, after last week's performance, of which we downgraded them a point, we have them 14th right now, and I think that's ultimately the battle that we have seen. The talent is plentiful. The depth is not, and the schedule is quite manageable. So you're seeing that culmination of they have the premium talent. They're not really playing anybody. Let's see what the roster looks like in terms of attrition, because this is an attrition-like sport, down the road. And I think you're just looking at a tough test potentially when you play Utah. But going back to last week, another lucky outcome. Oregon State's defense may have given the blueprint to how to defend this offense. And they were fantastic. And I think that's the one element where you can get pressure on USC. Their offensive line much better as run blockers than in pass protection. The coverage schemes on the back end were fantastic. Oregon State kept them in it. Defensively, they were better than I thought. And then the turnover bug. Chance Nolan did everything he could to give that game away. And that's the one thing, when you have a veteran quarterback like that, it's fine if the offense isn't humming, but understand the game state and situation. And when you're up 7-3 and it's a rock fight on 3rd and 12 in your own end, let's not throw an interception to absolutely nobody trying to force a ball in there. A punt is fine in that situation with the game state. Even late, when you have a chance to go out there and win, I understand taking deep shots at midfield, but it's first down. Let's find an open guy. So Chance Nolan was horrific for Oregon State last week, and despite that, still got away with the cover. And I thought there was, again, we're seeing this, right? And you don't want to cry over stuff like this because it sounds terrible, but USC wasn't flagged for a penalty either last week. And then they got a very critical one when Oregon State should have had 1st and goal from the 6. You call a very ticky-tack holding call that sent them back, and eventually Chance Nolan had a horrific decision on 3rd down, and it led to a long field goal that was missed. But USC right now, a lot of premium talent, a lot of offensive talent specifically, just not playing anybody. And I think ultimately Utah's going to be their kryptonite. Now, you look at Utah defensively, they play a lot of man, not necessarily what they saw from Oregon State that kind of befuddled them on offense. So that'll be interesting to see if Utah can hold up with some of their man coverage principles against those athletes. But there's just not a lot of tests.
Yeah, that's the whole thing, and we talked about it for SC, that, look, they could be overvalued in the market, but the reason their win total was as high as it was is because the schedule of opponents, no Oregon, no Washington, the trip to Rice-Eccles the most daunting, and I'm very curious in a couple short weeks where that number opens up. I'm not sure Washington State or Arizona State over the next 2 weeks will be able to push them. Before we bring Brad...
And this is a business, right?
Oh,
at the end of the day, there was a lot of sharp guys. There was a lot of sharp guys, right, that had differing opinions on USC. At 9.5, people liked the under. They were as high as 50-1 to win the college football playoff, and people said to themselves, well, one, they have premium talent. Two, the schedule is so shoddy. Let me take a little flyer on this if they can maintain some health. And currently what you're seeing unfold is the brand of USC, the storyline of Lincoln Riley and all those transfers coming in. They're going to be aided by the Pac-12. They're going to be aided by voters. And if they can run the table, you bet your ass they're going to be in the college football playoff, and you bet your ass I can't wait to fade them then.
Yeah, they may be 2 touchdown underdogs if they happen to run the table and get there. I will say that the game against Notre Dame that I think a lot of people, USC will be just fine in that spot, is another game to circle. We'll see if Marcus Freeman can continue to make strides there. Obviously, the Irish get a resounding win last weekend against North Carolina to silence the Boo Birds for a bit. But we have a ton of ground to cover. Did want to just ask you, though, was there anything else that you particularly saw stand out last weekend in watching college football?
I know a game that we'll break down a little bit in terms of like both those teams, right? Wake and Clemson, they're on the docket for us today. But going back to that, I thought the wrong team won that game. I thought Wake Forest was the better team. I was a little surprised, and I understand it was the looks that Wake Forest was given, right? They go up there, they run their play, right? It's a slow mesh. We're either handing it off based upon what the defense gives us, or we're taking the one-on-one shot outside based upon what the defense is giving us. But as good as Hartman was, to see him only throw it 29 times, it felt like whether it was himself or the defense that he was seeing late, or whether it was Clausen, the game kind of was taken out of his hands late. And I thought if he was a little bit more aggressive, that they probably would have gotten the win there. But ultimately in the box score, they were a 4-point winner despite losing by 6 in overtime.
And you mentioned Wake. It's one of the games that we have on the schedule, and we may as well get into the meat of this podcast. He joins us every Wednesday as a member of the Bet the Board family to help us break down the biggest games in college football. You, of course, can follow Brad Powers on Twitter at BradPower7. And Brad, I got to come off the top ropes with the opening question. We touched on it a little bit at the top of the show with Payne, but I'm quickly becoming persona non grata in my own household for my disdain or overvaluation for the USC Trojans. Can you shed a little bit of light on how USC is being perceived in the market and the kind of adjustments you've had to make through the first couple of games of the Lincoln Riley era?
Well, I share that disdain because I found myself in similar shoes where I shut that game off last Saturday after the ridiculous recover of a fumble at their own 1-yard line. An offensive lineman laying on his back somehow recovers a fumble that would have been disastrous for USC against Oregon State. Somehow, some way, I'm so thankful we took that one home despite being -4 in turnovers on the Oregon State side. But on the USC side, when you look at the turnover margin, it's unbelievable. Plus 14 on the season, by far number 1 in the country. Coming into the season, look, I thought USC would be, I had them as the most improved Power 5 team in the country. But with that being said, I also thought they were the most overrated team in the country because they're priced like a borderline top 5 team, and I just did not see them making that large of a jump up from a 4-8 team a year ago with so many new players to the roster. I do have them upgraded from the start of the season. Obviously, I think the offense has lived up to expectations. The defense hasn't. I don't think the turnover luck can continue, but they are in the Pac-12, and there's not a lot of teams that can take advantage of them. But besides, Utah, and we'll see at the end of the season what Notre Dame and UCLA look like at that point. But no Washington and Oregon on the regular season schedule. I do not have USC, though, believe it or not, in my top 10. Even though they sit there, number 6 in the AP poll, I still do not have them in my top 10.
Yeah, I'm so curious to see how this team gets priced going forward. Obviously, they took a little bit of money in the market, and this isn't one of the big games we're breaking down for those folks that are tuning in going, what the hell's going on? USC plays Arizona State. They took some money there, and I'm curious to see where they get priced next week for Washington State. And, of course, the game you alluded to in the middle of October that I think every Pac-12 football fan had circled even before the schedule was set up, the trip to Salt Lake City against Utah, especially if they play at night at Rice-Eccles. It could be a slightly different animal than what they've encountered even at Research Stadium. But the reason I bring up USC is because their inner-city rival has one of the marquee games of the week in the Pac-12, and it'll kick off Friday night under the bright lights in the Rose Bowl as they'll welcome in upstart Washington. You're looking at the Huskies, a 3-point favorite on the road in this game, total of 66. And I guess, Brad, the first question I have for you in regards to Washington, what have you done with their power number? Seeing how well Michael Penix has played, obviously it's been a perfect marriage with Kalen DeBoer going back to their time in Indiana together.
So I got them up nearly a full touchdown over what they were in the preseason. And my gut instinct tells me that's a little conservative. I am typically a little conservative. I'm not upgrading, downgrading teams double digits. But maybe I should with Washington's case because they were a team that was historically bad offensively last couple of years. Brand new offensive system. Kalen DeBoer, we mentioned it on this podcast a couple weeks ago when they were preparing to play Michigan State. Maybe the most underrated coach in the country. And I can say that because if you go back to his days as an offensive coordinator at Eastern Michigan, so we're talking last 6-7 years, teams that he coaches on, whether he's the offense coordinator or head coach, cover point spreads, 71% against the spread the last 6+ seasons. And right now, here at Washington this year, they've covered all 4 games. So, I mean, Payne mentions it. Teams that he coaches get better immediately and seem to drop off immediately after he leaves. So I think Kalen DeBoer is maybe a top 10 head coach right now, but he's certainly not getting priced like it in the market. So big upgrade for Washington so far in my power ratings.
Doing incredible things in Payne just to kind of set this game up. When you look at these two offenses, the only Pac-12 offenses averaging 500-plus yards per game. Washington, as Brad mentioned, not only 4-0 straight up, but 4-0 against the number, looking to get to 5-0 for the first time as a program since 2017. UCLA, well, you look at what they're doing. They're trying to get to 5-0 for the first time since 2013. They haven't won 7 straight before this stretch as a program since 2005. And when you look at what the Bruins are doing, they're using second-half dominance to get there. 171-37 in the second halves of those games. And what's interesting enough, when you try and figure out what kind of home field advantage UCLA has, I think the administration realizes they don't have much to brag about. According to the LA Daily News and doing some reading for this week, UCLA has purchased 10 digital billboards promoting the Friday game located throughout the Valley. If you guys want, you can go to local Costco locations and get a pair of tickets for UCLA sideline seats for $99. The Bruins are also giving out complimentary tickets to K through 12 classrooms, something that our Las Vegas Lights do here to fill a USL soccer stadium. Payne, I asked when you handicap this game, Brad talked about Washington. We've seen them tested at least to a certain level against Michigan State and Stanford. UCLA had to go the full 60 minutes to dispatch a good South Alabama team, but still some red flags. What's the single biggest matchup that you're looking for on Friday night?
Brad touched on the offense already, and I think we've beaten that drum a couple weeks now with Kalen DeBoer and Michael Penix, and he's just executing to near perfection. Did overthrow a few deep balls against Stanford, but it is a short week. Regardless of the home field advantage, there's some travel here, so it's difficult. But the one thing I noticed about Washington's defense going back and watching a few of their games and then comparing what I saw to the data, the Huskies' defense has struggled against mobile quarterbacks so far. And that's what you're going to see with UCLA and Dorian Thompson-Robinson. If you look at the first couple matchups, Washington's defense faced Kent State quarterback Colin Schlee. He had 0.84 EPA per rush in that game. And then you have Dante Sauchere, 0.43 EPA per rush when you remove sack yardage. So they gave that up against Portland State. And then even Peyton Thorne. I know that's a game that we ended up on at the buzzer there. But he was able to extend drives with his legs and keep Michigan State alive and kind of flirted with the backdoor cover there with some of his scrambling ability. Positive 0.38 EPA per rush for Peyton Thorne. And now you get DTR. And I know he's not playing his best ball, and there's been some weirdness with him getting taken out of the game at times. He's fumbled 4 times, but he's still averaging 8.6 yards a carry. He has the ability to scramble when a play is broken and take a zero and make it a play that keeps UCLA ahead of the chains. He's also averaging 12 yards per scramble. So those undesigned runs, he's just been gashing defenses. And if you look through 4 weeks, positive 0.65 EPA per rush. Quarterback scrambles, we kind of just take them for granted, right? but they are the most efficient running play in all of football. It doesn't matter what it is. The quarterback scramble is by far and away the most efficient run in football. And then you think about, potentially not just scrambling, but using his legs to evade pressure, buy more time for his receivers. I think that's the question mark on Washington's defense, is their secondary. It wasn't a very deep unit to begin with, lost a lot of talent to the draft, and now you have guys that are a little bit banged up playing out of position. So at this point, I think, we expect Washington's offense to be solid, but I think it's about, if you want to go on the road and cover this number, it's about stopping DTR's legs. And it's going to be difficult, right? It's a short week. I understand, as you alluded to, no home field advantage. But I think we're going to see a little bit of a battle here in this game. Saw it a little bit yesterday. I did see a group come in on UCLA plus the 3.5 and even took some money line. I think there's going to be the other element of this where, we're a little higher on Washington than others, and you might see the 3 get laid here. So I think there's going to be a full-blown battle in this game.
It's so interesting when you look at Washington so far this season. They definitely have gone out there. They've been the dominant side. They've held a 10-point lead or greater for more than 76% of the game time that we've seen them log over the first 4 weeks. And while it hasn't been a murderer's row, Kent State, Portland State, Michigan State, and Stanford, there still are 2 very dominant Power 5 victories in there, which, Brad, is more than we can say about UCLA. Just real quickly, I know we obviously wanted to highlight Washington and the way you've upgraded them. Have you done anything with UCLA? Or is it more, hey, look, it's got to be wait and see until they actually play a team with a pulse from a power conference?
A lot more wait and see on the UCLA side, although I've downgraded them a point, mainly due to the South Alabama game. I mean, that's the only team in my power ratings that ranks in the top 115 that UCLA has played so far. And what happened in the game? Well, they almost lost outright as a 2-touchdown plus favorite. I get it. South Alabama's been really good. South Alabama's covered every point spread by nearly 3 touchdowns per game this season. So that might have been an underrated team, but still, the reality is Washington's much, much better than South Alabama. So I think, to me, that is the key factor of the game, is we will finally see what UCLA is in 2022, because, quite frankly, along with Michigan, it was as weak of a non-conference schedule as any team faced, at least among the Power 5.
Such a fascinating matchup for a variety of reasons, and Washington, of course, has garnered the attention of bettors in the futures market. When you look at their odds to win the Pac-12 coming into the season, widely available at prices of north of 20-1. They're now in that logjam in the so-called second tier in the Pac-12, behind the USC's, Utah's, and Oregon's, given how well Michael Penix has performed. And speaking of awards, Michael Penix, we've seen his odds to win the Heisman Trophy get shortened substantially. This will be a chance for him to really put his stake in the ground on a national TV audience, albeit late on Friday night. From one coast to the other, gentlemen, we head to Tallahassee, where Florida State will welcome in the Wake Forest Demon Deacons, and an interesting game from a numbers perspective. We saw a couple books open Florida State as low as 3 or 4 in some spots. Numbers gotten as high as 7. That's pretty much the market consensus, but there is a little bit of resistance when we get to that peak. This will be the 40th matchup between the Seminoles and Demon Deacons. Florida State, an overwhelming series lead, 30 wins, 8 losses, and 1 tie. Despite winning only 8 games against the Noles, though, the Deacons have won the last 2 matchups back in 2019 and 2021. They have not won in Tallahassee at Doak Campbell Stadium, though, going all the way back to 2008. When you look at the way things have played out for these teams, Brad, Florida State coming into the year, I know there was a lot of optimism, not just from Payne, but from actual other people throughout the media about where this team could be. What have you noticed from the Seminoles so far? I think the most eye-opening performance may not have been against LSU Labor Day weekend, but exceeding market expectations in back-to-back weeks, doing it in dominant fashion against BC last Saturday.
Well, I'll start with the Friday night game against Louisville, where I thought they were dead in the water. And Jordan Travis gets hurt. There's other injuries, including, Verse on the defensive line. Maybe their best defensive lineman is also out in that game. They already had a defensive tackle out. Injuries in the secondary. They're getting beat. Rodemaker comes in, throws an early pick, and I'm betting. I am racing to every window I can and betting Louisville. And somehow, some way, Florida State controls the second half. They have a really brilliant game plan as far as I'm concerned to come out in that second half, and they get a nice road win. And they followed up. I thought they were pricey last week. I get it. BC hasn't been great by any stretch of the imagination. destination, but Florida State took care of business, dominated a team that they should control. I mean, that was impressive. I think the main thing with Florida State starts at quarterback. Jordan Travis is one of the most improved quarterbacks in the country when it comes to the throw game. He makes the right reads. I think offensively, Norvell's calling, play calling, while some instances at the goal line in a couple of games have left a little bit to be desired. But other than that, I mean, they're balanced. They have 3 legitimate running backs, 3 decent wide receivers. I mean, there's not a lot of weaknesses on this Florida State team. Now, I mean, obviously they're not an Ohio State offensively, but man, there's not much to complain. I mean, obviously the offensive line has also improved this year.
There's definitely reason to be optimistic given what we've seen from Jordan Travis, and he probably will have to be at his best in potential elements Saturday, depending on what kind of fallout we see from the hurricane, I should say. When you look at Wake Forest, though, Payne, I mean, 25% of Wake drives this year have graded out explosive. Almost half of their offensive series have picked up 2+ first downs. This is a team top 20 in scoring offense, red zone offense, passing touchdowns, passing efficiency, yards per completion. They exploded last week. They executed their mesh concept almost perfectly against Clemson, coming up just short in a 51-45 shootout. Does Florida State have the playmakers defensively, specifically in the secondary, to slow down Sam Hartman and what I think we both believe is one of the nation's most underrated receiving corps?
I appreciate you letting me talk about this game after last week. I was told I couldn't speak about Florida State anymore.
Well, if they continue to win games and they're nationally relevant, we're going to have to find a way to weave them into the podcast, whether I like it or not.
So obviously I'm a Sam Hartman guy, and I thought he was elite last week against Clemson. Wake Forest got the short end of the stick. Wake was a 4-point winner in the advanced box score. They were better down to down in terms of success rate than Clemson. They were more explosive than Clemson. This is, to me, far and away the toughest test Adam Fuller and Florida State's defense faced this season. I mean, you look, it's Duquesne, it's LSU game 1 of a new coaching regime, Louisville, Boston College. I mean, that's an FCS offense and 3 FBS offenses that have an average adjusted schedule efficiency rank of 61st. This is a legitimate top 10 offense you're getting in Wake now. And they want to put you in conflict. You hit it perfectly. Like A.T. Perry and Donovan Green, there's the guys that are outside that just win one-on-one. Wake will hit you with tempo, 20 seconds per play. They want to tire you out physically, so they break you mentally and get you out of position. And, last season, Wake ran 54 plays in the first half against FSU. Those guys were dog tired in the second half. And here's the concern I think that I have on this side of the ball is Florida State's 113th in standard down success rate. Over 56% of opponent run plays have gained 4 or more yards. The defense has only stuffed 14% of runs. They're allowing 3.5 line yards per rush. And Brad hit this perfectly. Fabian Lovett is the man in the middle. He's Florida State's top defensive tackle. He's out. He was seen with a boot on his foot during the BC game on the sideline. He was walking with a cane. Jared Verse is highly questionable. Malcolm Ray, FSU's 3rd guy in the defensive tackle rotation, is banged up, not 100%, dealing with a shoulder injury from the Louisville game. Did play last week, but not a bunch of snaps. Robert Cooper, the big 335-pound nose tackle for Florida State, has to have the best game of his season in this spot. Through 3 games, his run grade defensively is the worst over his 5-year college career, so he's got to get it together in this matchup. If FSU can't defend the slow mesh rush attempts with 6 or 7, that's going to be a problem because it forces you to load the box, and then Sam Hartman just has no problem throwing up very accurate one-on-one balls outside. FSU's outside the top 100 in rushing success rate defense right now. I think the positive here is Amarion Cooper looks like he's healthy again. That's Florida State's number 1 corner coming into the season. If he can play A.T. Perry to somewhat of a stalemate, I think that would be a positive. There's questions past him. You obviously have Renardo Green and Jerrion Jones, 2 veterans, but they're just average. We saw last week Florida State try to get the true freshman Azare Thomas up to speed, played him a bunch against BC, trying to get his confidence up. He looks like a 5-star talent and the best kid they took in the class this past year, so I think he'll play a little bit of a role here. But FSU outside the top 80 in explosive pass defense, and you just outlined, Todd, that Wake is very explosive. It's just hard to confuse Hartman, right? But you have to throw off his timing and rhythm. That's the key to this whole thing. But last week, like even when Clemson was pressuring Sam Hartman, 42% of his dropbacks he got pressured, still ended the game with an 81% adjusted accuracy. So I think Florida State has their hands full here. And if the option is playing zone and you can't stop the run with 6, this gets a little bit difficult. Florida State also has tried playing zone a little bit this year. They've been horrific in zone coverage. So if the weather holds up here, I think this total is pretty interesting because Brad alluded to the offensive side for Florida State just being a little bit more dynamic with Jordan Travis just improving greatly as a passer.
It's so interesting because you look at Wake Forest, and we've obviously seen them put up gaudy rushing numbers to create a little bit of balance, but they've really struggled in that department. 31 carries for 100 yards running from Ellison and Turner last week. Not necessarily a red flag against a Clemson front seven that's underwhelmed, and we will get to Clemson shortly, but more the 14 carries for 9 yards that they were able to put together against Liberty when they outlasted the Flames 37-36. So to your point, I'm curious to see if Florida State can stop the run with 6 and do a little bit more in the back. Glowing reports out of Tallahassee as far as how the secondary performed in Tuesday practice. Take it for what you will. I want to double back to you real quick, Payne, on the number for the game. We did see it open substantially lower in the 3 and 4 range. Fair or foul the way that the market has responded to Florida State? Do we think they're factoring a little bit of a letdown as well for Wake Forest?
I'm not the guy that got out and laid 3 at Will Hill this week. You tell me about it, Todd.
Sometimes I try and lead a horse to water. Thankfully, we were on the same page for a Thursday night NFL game that we shared with our listeners that we beat the market by about 4.5
I was busy sweating an NFL game that I didn't know I needed to sweat, but apparently, the Minnesota Vikings weren't the easiest
here we go.
Survivor contest.
Brad, this is the kind of bullshit I deal with around here. Well, I know when Payne goes radio silent on Sunday, it's because he's extremely frustrated with me, like a disappointed father figure of sorts. So we had a full-blown back and forth to peel back the curtain a little bit, and I'm sure our college listeners are going, what the hell are you guys talking about who we were going to use in Survivor. Payne's particular side that he would have preferred got there in rocking chair style. I decided to add a little drama to our Sundays, and we had a sweat out, a Kirk Cousins last-minute comeback erasing a double-digit deficit. Never in doubt, game goes over the total, and here I am 72 hours later having to justify my selection.
I like
This is why I'm a bigger Kirk Cousins fan than you. I mean, that was just the double whopper. Got us the Survivor win and the over.
Oh, see, that's what you have to do. You got to and Kirk you trust, as the case may be. A game maybe that'll make the Thursday rotation when they take on the Saints in London over the weekend. But all right, boys, let's stay in the ACC to the marquee game of the weekend, where Clemson, as a 6.5-point favorite, they'll welcome in the NC State Wolfpack. We have obviously seen a massive move on this total from a high of 46 at a prominent offshore, 44.5 here in town, now to a total that's painted in the high 30s. The big question here is what kind of weather impact we'll see for the Saturday evening kickoff. When you look at the Wolfpack, they memorably defeated Notre Dame back in 2016 by a score of 10-3 during Hurricane Matthew. Dave Dorn and the coaching staff has brought that up multiple times in terms of how they're factoring that into their preparation. NC State beat Clemson a year ago in Raleigh, 27-21, and the Wolfpack are enjoying their first top 10 ranking since reaching this same height way back in 2002. The last time they actually climbed higher than 10th in the country was a number 8 ranking way back in 1974. But you look at NC State, just 1-11 since the turn of the century against top 5 teams. The lone win coming against, here we go, number 3 Florida State back in 2012 at Carter Finley Stadium. Clemson, meanwhile, has won 36 straight home games in Death Valley. Just 5 of those 36 games, though, when you look, have been against ranked opponents. Brad, this is a Clemson defense that all of us thought was going to be dynamic, potential to be the best in the country. That front seven, for me, has underwhelmed early on. The secondary issues against Wake Forest aside, but suddenly Clemson appears to have a living, breathing offense, something that they couldn't find if their life depended on it throughout the 2021 campaign.
Certainly, and they've needed that offense last week because, on the defense side of the ball, I mean, they quite simply couldn't stop Wake Forest in the past game. But offensively, we expected them to be improved. That, but compared to last year, that's not saying much, but so far so good. They're averaging 18 points per game more this season, 100 yards per game, better than last season. It obviously starts at the quarterback spot. Uyunglele, all right numbers as far as I'm concerned, 64%, 10-1 touchdown interception ratio. I mean, last year it was a negative touchdown interception ratio. I still think he's inaccurate at times where he has wide receivers that are open for touchdowns, but I mean, that was one of probably his best performance last week, going all the way back to his, one of his first starts against Notre Dame a couple years ago. So it's so far so good on the Clemson offense. But I hear you, Todd. That defense has certainly disappointed, and it's a big reason why I downgraded Clemson in my power rating since the start of the season.
Pretty wild when you look at what Clemson has done offensively. According to Clemson Sports Information, the 175 points that they have through 4 games is tied for the second most points the Tigers have ever scored through the first 4 games of a season. And you look at their offense, and I wouldn't put them obviously anywhere close to what we've seen from the likes of Georgia at their best and Ohio State. Brad, you talked about downgrading their power ratings, and Payne, I'll throw it to you here. Clemson secondary looked like they were absolutely exposed last week against Wake Forest. Practice reports indicate that they should be healthier there, but we haven't officially seen some of those key contributors and veterans upgraded. If there is weather in the forecast, or even if there's not, is there enough in this NC State passing game that should scare Clemson? It's essentially been Thayer Thomas and nobody else, and Devin Leary, to me, has underwhelmed early on so far this season.
I think you obviously have to factor in the weather, and that takes out a lot of this handicap within the matchup because you're going to have the remnants of Hurricane Ian dumping down. Right now, it looks like 80% chance of rain. The wind has subsided just a touch, but we'll see. We're keeping an eye on the hurricane, obviously, but there were projected 18-mile-per-hour winds last night. Checked this morning, it's down to about 11. So that would be huge, I think, in this matchup, especially with what NC State should be doing. Now, I know they're practicing all week with wet footballs to simulate the conditions. I just hope things clear up. I don't like the rescheduling and the canceling of games, but obviously when you have a matchup that's going to have a huge say in who potentially wins the ACC, you'd like to at least have it play out normally. But I think the game plan would have been straightforward for NC State if, Dave Dorn kind of recognizes what he should be doing. It's very clear at this point he has to let the all-world quarterback just cook, right? Devin Leary has to be the guy. That's how you have to lead your offense. And I come back to what we said in our NC State season preview, that I believe NC State's peak comes down to Dave Dorn and Tim Beck being willing to lean on Devin Leary more than ever. And it just hasn't been the case here. You have a defensive-minded head coach, which I just do not like, and I understand they're winning games. But there's just too much running. And when you look at the efficiency, you can't be 49% run this season when you're outside the top 60 in EPA per rush. You can't be so heavy with early down runs and just wonder why you're outside the top 80 and bypassing third downs and early downs. You look at Clemson, you kind of hit on this a little bit. Defensively, they're 105th in passing success rate allowed, 107th in completion rate allowed, 92nd in passer rating allowed. NC State has to attack Clemson through the air, and they might have a better chance doing it as again, the wind kind of subsides here. If Dave Dorn's smart, he breaks his own tendency. Play action passing early and often. Devin Leary, 18th out of 141 qualifying quarterbacks in play action passer rating. So again, break your own tendency, come out with the play action pass, attack that weakness. I mean, at all costs, NC State has to avoid running at Clemson. And I understand you mentioned last week, but really when Wake Forest was able to run the ball, it's when they decided to help their secondary. And those were the looks that were being given with a light box. It didn't really transpire until late in the game that Wake Forest was able to run on Clemson. All told, the Tigers are second in EPA per rush allowed. They've stuffed 24% of running plays. This has to be a Devin Leary game if NC State has any chance of staying within this number. But to your point, let's keep an eye on the injury report. Dabo released the depth chart. It included the 3 guys in the secondary that didn't play at Wake last week. So something to monitor here for sure. But I got to tell you, at 39.5, if the wind were to clear here, that's a light number. And especially if you had intel on what NC State chooses to do, that would be an even lighter number.
Can I ask a question of both of you? And this isn't so much in just this game specifically, but more when you look at the big picture as far as weather and trying to account for some of those elements. Brad, I know you typically take a high volume approach, a little bit different than Payne and I when it comes to approaching the college football board. But when you're anticipating weather, do you find it's just best to get out ahead of it and figuring out what to do with some of those positions? Or do you want to make sure that the forecast is actually going to come to fruition more so than putting a little bit more powder into play?
Yeah, nowadays you just get out in front of it because the market is. I mean, if you sit and wait, you're going to miss numbers. I mean, I did find it interesting that I woke up at 5 a.m. Pacific time on Monday morning and the board's lit up. They're betting unders already as far as the weather games in the Carolinas. So usually in previous seasons didn't happen until limits opened up a little bit on Tuesdays, and you waited an extra 36 hours for that weather forecast to clear up. But typically, I like to get out in front of things, and I'll worry about it later. Certainly, there's some opportunity to play back some overs at this point. I mean, some of these have moved to 10-plus points. I will say, though, I'm a guy that likes to, I've been accused of bragging a time or two about getting good numbers, but I took a bad number because the way Payne broke this down is one of the major reasons why I was thinking over originally. I wasn't thinking about the weather forecast when I bet this over on the opener at 44.5. I thought at that point it was extremely light. I thought NC State could have their way in the past game against Clemson, and I also, we touched on it earlier, Clemson's improvement on the offense side of the ball against an NC State defense that really hasn't faced anybody yet. So my early inkling was over in this game, and if the weather does clear up, I'm going to go right back to it and continue to fire on the over.
Perfect. Weighted cost averaging. It's what anyone who knows who invests in financial markets do. You lower the strength of your position from the top and come in at a better number. Payne, similar sentiments from you as well in terms of how you'll approach the college board with weather, 5 to 6 days out?
Yeah, I think at this point you just want to attack the number, figure out what to do with it later, especially when you start thinking about the key numbers in college football. A lot of these totals were above the 55. They're now down below the 55. The one thing that you do have to track in this game is just keep in tune with the weather. The one thing that could be concerning is if it is just dumping down rain and you have a conservative defensive-minded coach in Dave Dorn. And the other element here is Dabo Swinney, even though the offense has improved, as Brad alluded to, he's been super conservative with his coaching style. Quite literally this season, Clemson's lost the most win probability of any Power 5 team by kicking the ball in situations where they should have gone for it. And that's ultimately what's kept me off this side is I'll just be forthcoming. Like, my number on this game is Clemson minus 7.5. The total's 39.5 at the sharper spots. That means points are at a premium, and then you get this conservative nature from Dabo, and it makes it a little bit more difficult laying it, even though I do show about a point of value through the 7.
Well, if we think weather could impact one of the marquee games of the day in Clemson, South Carolina, if the total is any indication, bettors clearly believe that weather could impact what we're going to see unfold in Norfolk, Virginia, Saturday afternoon, where Old Dominion will welcome in Liberty, and you're looking at Liberty, a 2-point road favorite. This total, as I alluded to, opened 54.5 at some shops out here. We're now looking at a 41.5 as the consensus. This is a Liberty team that if you're just looking at the scoreboard, you see them sneak by Akron last week as a massive favorite. But Brad, there's obviously a lot more to that result that the untrained eye necessarily wouldn't pick up looking at the final score or even digging into the box.
Yeah, so I think, generally speaking, Liberty's being punished way too much for that performance against Akron. I get it. They were a near 4-touchdown favorite. It didn't look good at all as far as the box score or the scoreboard in the game against a really, really bad Akron team. But keep in mind, Liberty was down to not a backup quarterback, a third-string quarterback. And on top of it, they had a couple guys out on the offensive line. They had to play 7-8 different guys or changing the offensive lineups during the game to find the right combination. They had some other guys banged up at the skill position, wide receiver and running back. A couple defensive players, they sat out for precautionary reasons. So that was a very banged-up Liberty team that was probably thinking that even with all that, they could still find a way to get a win over a bad Akron team, and that was exactly the case. But I'd like to think this week, reading the tea leaves, not only in Hugh Freeze's press conference, but I physically watched their practice yesterday. Now, I didn't, fly to, Virginia to watch it in person, but I watched the highlights, and it looks like...
I figured Saban would have lent you his chopper at this point. He could have just landed it right down on the field.
There you go. I did watch the backup Salter, very, talented kid that led him to a near upset over a pretty good Wake Forest team just a week prior. He was moving around pretty good, throwing with some velocity, running around. He did have a knee brace on, but wasn't limping noticeably. I expect him to play here. And if that's the case, then the line seems relatively light, especially when you consider the Old Dominion side. I think the final scores might be a little bit better than how Old Dominion's played this year, particularly when you look at, the Virginia Tech and Virginia performances. They upset Virginia Tech outright. It was a Friday night game that got a lot of pub, and then nearly upset Virginia. Those games haven't aged too well because Virginia Tech and Virginia are just bad this year with first-year coaches. So, and on top of it, Old Dominion's getting outgained by nearly 150 yards per game, despite all that. So, I think there's some value. Let's just put it this way. Even if there's a little bit of weather, and certainly watch that weather forecast, but this is one where I would not be surprised if Salters announces a starter and a couple of those starters are also announced in the lineup like I expect. This one might blow through 3.
And this is a Monarchs team that coming into the season was expected to have continuity and an underrated offense. It's been anything but. They did battle back last week, beating Arkansas State 29-26, but underwhelmed as far as odds makers' expectations, failing to cover as a closing favorite of in that 4.5 and 5 range. Payne, I know non-powers 5 games are right in your wheelhouse too. Do you have anything you'd like to add to this particular matchup and bless us with your time on the little guys?
Appreciate your sarcasm there, bud. But I will tell you, I stumbled upon this game, and I saw the same thing Brad saw, that the backup quarterback that went into Wake Forest and nearly won that game outright should be upgraded along with Liberty's left tackle and left guard. And I shot that note to Brad, and Brad was whisper quiet. And right then and there, I knew that I might have found something. To Brad's point, though, let's keep an eye on the weather, because in the morning, it looks terrible. 80% chance of rain, 20-plus mile-per-hour winds. But at kickoff here at 6 o'clock, it looks like that has a chance to subside a little bit. And I think Brad hit it perfectly. When I look at Old Dominion, that offense is one of the worst in the country right now. And they were certainly aided by a bunch of turnovers on national TV against Virginia Tech. So I do think once those guys get upgraded, this will blow through the 3.
All right, from the little guys back to the big guys. But I want to remind all of our loyal listeners, you can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. You can follow me there. That's at Todd Furman. Brad Powers at Brad Powers 7. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. All right, from Norfolk, Virginia, gentlemen, we'll head to Waco, Texas, where Baylor and Oklahoma State will renew acquaintances. A rematch of last year's Big 12 championship game, one that Oklahoma State fans wish went 2 yards more favorably in their favor. Baylor's goal in this contest, well, obviously, is to play keep away. You look at the numbers across the board. Baylor, a 1-point favorite, up to 2.5, depending on where you shop. The total widely available in that 56.5 to 57 range. Baylor so far this year, they've been akin to long, methodical drives, including one that salted away their win last week against Iowa State on the road. Meanwhile, Oklahoma State remains arguably the most unassuming top 10 program in the country over the last 2 seasons, 17-2 in their last 19 games. If we go back to December of 2020, a stretch which starts when they won their last visit to Waco after having lost 3 of their previous 5 trips. However, the most consequential loss is the one I mentioned at the top, losing that conference championship coming up a yard short in Jerry's World, which may or may not have punched their ticket to the college football playoff. Brad, we talked a lot about this with UCLA not really having played anybody. I think Oklahoma State falls into that same particular bucket where we've seen Baylor go on the road, acquit themselves quite nicely, losing in overtime to BYU, beating Iowa State last week. But Oklahoma State does have a little bit of a rest advantage, 2 weeks to prepare for this matchup. What do we know about the Cowboys through the first 3 data points?
In short, not much because of what you pointed out. I mean, they haven't played Oklahoma State, a single top 75 team in my power ratings so far. They haven't played a road game yet. I mean, obviously the Arizona State performance hasn't aged well with what, Arizona State's become now with an interim coach. So I don't know that we have a really good look on Oklahoma State. I know they were really impressive in that first half against Central Michigan, then took their foot off the gas pedal and, blew what seemed to be an easy cover in that game. But I also think, Todd, because you're such a sharp guy, you also mentioned the fact that I think the situational spot does favor Oklahoma State here. Baylor has been through a little bit of the grinder here the last 3 weeks, playing a couple of road games at BYU, at Iowa State, while Oklahoma State could have keyed in on this game, even prior to the bye, played a really bad FCS team. So I have a sneaky suspicion, considering that they came up 1 yard short of a Big 12 championship game, that they've been prepping for this game, not only for the last couple of weeks, but maybe even snuck in a little bit in the summer and fall camp. So situationally, I do think this is the Oklahoma State side in this one.
And if the prep is going to be there, Payne, obviously it's about making Spencer Sanders comfortable in the pocket. He'll make his 36th career start under center for Mike Gundy. He's on pace for career highs across the board in 2022, a completion percentage north of 65%, averaging almost 10 yards per attempt. His efficiency numbers off the charts. But last year, Baylor found something in trying to defend Oklahoma State. Sanders threw 12 interceptions for the year. 7 of those came in the 2 games against Dave Aranda's led defense. And when you look at trying to figure out some of those wrinkles, I know we haven't necessarily been as big a Spencer Sanders fan as some of the Oklahoma State folks out there. Have you seen enough to lead you to believe that he can be the guy to go into hostile territory, get the ball into space with some of his weapons, and allow Oklahoma State to have better success than what we've seen against Baylor in the past?
Well, I think when you look at this, there's indicators when you start betting games, okay? And Brad alluded to thinking Oklahoma State is the side. Traditionally, that would be the case, right? Like, look at the total. The total's gotten steamed up. Which of these teams is the pace monster? And that's the one thing that's changed dramatically year over year for Oklahoma State's offense. They're now 5th in plays per minute. And that's one thing that I've noticed immediately when breaking down this game. The other element here is when I look at Baylor's offense and how Oklahoma State elects to defend them, that would give me more reason to think that going over 50.5, whoever did that at open, has a very good bet, because I think Baylor's offense will have some success here as well, right? I mean, Baylor right now, I understand, searching for some answers at receiver, but when you look at this matchup on paper, it appears like they have some advantages, right? I'm interested to see if Baylor breaks their tendency and comes out throwing more than usual. Blake Shapen looked substantially better last week, and from what I'm seeing with Oklahoma State's defense, they're playing more single high safety looks and loading the box. Small sample, but based on the caliber of competition with Central Michigan and Arizona State and Arkansas Pine Bluff, the defensive pass metrics shouldn't be this bad for Oklahoma State. I mean, they're outside the top 100 in EPA per pass allowed. Now, they play this aggressive style in the box and they run blitz frequently now, and that's why Oklahoma State's contacted ball carriers at or behind the line of scrimmage on 60% of rush attempts. But if Baylor comes out and they throw, I think they could have some early success. I would pass to set up the run. That's what makes sense in this spot. The other advantage here is, despite playing wildly different schedule discrepancies, and you guys hit this perfectly in that maybe there's a fatigue factor here for Baylor where Oklahoma State's kind of just had this one game circled, but Baylor is top 20 in the country on standard downs. Oklahoma State's defense on standard downs outside the top 70, despite having this massive discrepancy in schedules. Oklahoma State has just not been very good on early downs. They've let offenses bypass third downs far too often. And again, like, I don't have a horse in this race, but I can absolutely see why over 50.5 got smacked over. Oklahoma State's offensive pace, again, is just frenetic to start the season. I don't think Oklahoma State's going to be able to run, so the ball should be in the air on that side of the ball for Oklahoma State. The defense has regressed both in talent and scheme, and if Baylor breaks tendency and comes out throwing, the game just could have a different feel and look compared to the perception of these two defenses. Unfortunately, I missed the boat, right? And the total is
could have called me. I may or may not have one of those tickets.
Right, we've gone past the largest key number of 55 here. What number did you get, Brad?
52.5. So someone did beat me to the punch there. I wasn't the only one thinking over. I think Baylor's been, the last couple of weeks, their total's been power rated too low.
Yeah, that's just kind of the vibe breaking down this game. Like, I don't think Oklahoma State's defense is as good as perception. We're seeing that in the numbers. Even if you have priors included in them, this defense has just dropped just dropped off a cliff without Jim Knowles. So that's interesting to me. And if you get a little bit more confidence in Blake Shapen, which you should have after last week's performance, if Baylor comes out and breaks tendencies, this is going to be an interesting matchup.
Yeah, you mentioned Blake Shapen last week, 19 of 26 against Iowa State, 3 touchdown passes. The yardage doesn't blow you away, but I think anyone who watched that game noticed a very different quarterback on the road in that spot names than what we saw in Provo, where they tried to make him more of a pocket passer. Last week, it was getting him outside the tackle box, allowing him to use some of that athleticism as a former baseball player to try and throw on the run, and it paid dividends. Of course, the back-breaking play for Iowa State came on a little bit of trickeration, a ball that I think any of the three of us might have caught in that Iowa State end zone with no Cyclones player within 25 yards. And there's no doubt this is a Baylor team that came into the year. I think a lot of people were anticipating they were going to be overvalued in the market. I have to give the odds makers credit. I didn't think there was a lot of wiggle room in their season win total. Brad, one last thing on this game. When you look at Baylor's snapshot so far this year, have they been the team you expected, and have you made any changes to their power rating either in a positive or negative fashion?
Yeah, to piggyback off of the season win total, I thought, I was a little surprised at how much they kind of downgraded Baylor. I mean, I saw as low as 7.5 in the market. I actually thought that was a little low as far as Baylor's season win total. I think Dave Aranda is one of the best coaches out there, especially on the defense side of the ball. I've upgraded him slightly. 1 point, obviously didn't get home in the BYU game, but he did get home last week, a very impressive win against Iowa State. We'll say this, I always like to hark back to this as we get more data points. I always ask myself, if their kicker makes a field goal against BYU, I know the BYU kicker.
You had to go there, Brad.
Yeah, but I'm just saying,
didn't you?
What is this number if Baylor's undefeated? Are we that much closer to 3? I always, think about that as we move along towards the season.
That's what's so interesting.
You're supposed to forget about it after it happens. You just move on mentally.
That's what's so interesting about this game, guys, because you have the opportunity to lay 1 at one of the sharper shops out here now. You also have the opportunity to take 2.5. I'm very curious to see if this number, as we get closer to Saturday, inches towards 3, or if we start to see it trickle back towards pick'em. Fascinating when you watch some of the market-moving shops and the more influential books that are out there. All right, from the Big 12, which should be a great conference to watch all season long from top to bottom, to the SEC, where we're going to start to learn a heck of a lot more about a boatload of teams, and we have 3 straight SEC games coming. Spoiler alert for all you Big Ten fans, there wasn't a game that was worth a damn, as Payne and I have vowed not to break down Iowa football on this podcast until they reintroduce the forward pass into their offensive arsenal. So we're going to Starkville, early kickoff, 11 o'clock Central. I apologize. We're going to Oxford first, where Ole Miss is a 6.5-point favorite as they'll welcome in Kentucky. Total in the game, 53. Not much movement really on side or total. You did see 1-4 open up initially, and it got bet up. This is the first game where both teams are actually ranked between them since 1958. Kentucky looking for back-to-back 5-0 starts for the first time in over 70 years. Meanwhile, Ole Miss trying to extend its longest home win streak in nearly 60. They've won 12 straight in Oxford, longest since 16, spanning 1960 to 1964. First time that they'll do battle, though, in Oxford at Vaught-Hemingway Stadium with Lane Kiffin at the helm. When you look at Kentucky, Brad, one of the trademarks of this football program amid their rebuild, their resurgence, and actually becoming football relevant has all been around the offensive line. This is anything but a big blue wall up front, but they will get a breath of fresh air as Chris Rodriguez, their bell cow running back, returns to the mix after serving his 4-game suspension. But do you think his reintroduction into the fold will somehow allow this Kentucky team to run the football, what they haven't been able to do against the likes of Miami of Ohio and NIU, just to name a few, through the first 4 games of the season?
I have my doubts, even though I think Rodriguez is one of the more underrated backs in the entire country. He should at least give them some hope, because there hasn't been hope so far this season. I mean, only averaging 82 rush yards per game, and they played 2 MAC teams and an FCS team in the mix along with Florida so far. So it's been really bad on the offensive line. I mean, keep in mind they lost several starters, and more importantly, they lost their offensive line coach. Where'd he go? Well, a guy in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, seemed to think that the offensive line coach had been pretty good the last couple of years for Kentucky. He picked him up and fired, former NFL coach and Doug Marrone to make way for the Kentucky offensive line coach. So that has been their major concern, and you kind of seen it, put more weight on the shoulders of Will Levis, who some thinks a top 10 NFL pick. I don't think so. And, it's been, not great. I mean, if you look at the total QBR, number 60 in the country so far this season, he misses a playmaker on the outside, Wan'Dale Robinson, that used to take the top off the defenses. So I haven't been a big fan of what I've seen Kentucky offensively so far this season, starting up front on that offensive line.
When you look at the Wildcats' efficiency numbers, 54 of their 119 run plays have been stuffed, a 45% stuff rate, which is ghastly to think about when you look at the opponents Kentucky has played. Now, the Wildcats do, of course, have the most impressive win of these two teams when they went into Gainesville, won outright as a 6.5 point dog in a defensive slugfest. That should come with a caveat, though. Anthony Richardson looked a far cry from the quarterback we saw in full display with his athleticism and ability to stretch the field last week against Tennessee. Payne, when you break this game down, is there one specific matchup that you have your eye on that you think will define who wins the football game, but more importantly, who covers the number?
I think it's a really strong number as we approach 7 here. It's probably not the best indicator for Kentucky, but I think you guys hit it perfectly that if the Wildcats want to keep this within the number, they have to improve massively on the ground. And you guys know this offensive line just has not been great. We knew it would regress with the talent and the loss of coaching, but it's been really ugly early. You're looking at only creating 2.8 line yards of space. Linemen are not getting to the second level. Hopefully, Chris Rodriguez is the saving grace. I think he's one of the best backs in the country. It sounded like, from player quotes, coaches quotes, he's injected some energy into the locker room this week. If you don't have a great offensive line, getting a running back that averages 4.1 yards after first contact certainly helps. Chris Rodriguez generated the 4th most value of any running back in the country over the last 2 seasons. And for his size, you wouldn't think he would move as well as he does. 17% of his runs last year were explosive. And I think when I look at this matchup, maybe this is the type of defense that Kentucky's offensive line can have just a touch more success against, because Ole Miss is designed to stop the pass. They play a 3-2-6 base. And because of that, Ole Miss right now ranks 86th in standard down success rate allowed, over 3 line yards per rush. Ole Miss outside the top 75 in rushing success rate allowed, and that's against 4 offenses that have an average offensive efficiency rank of 103rd in the country. So they haven't played anybody offensively. So I do think with Rodriguez returning, you do have to make this manual adjustment up to Kentucky's offensive rating. And he's not just a good runner, but you go back to 2020, Rodriguez was Kentucky's best pass blocker. And Will Levis mentioned that this week about having a veteran who knows where to help, where to pick up oncoming blitzers, and he hits defenders so hard that they don't want to blitz anymore. So that's something in this matchup that I think is a huge get back for Kentucky, but they have to get this run game figured out to cover this number. Chris Rodriguez certainly helps that, but all indicators right now is that Ole Miss is the side here.
You know, Brad, when you look at Ole Miss, and Payne kind of mentioned it, talking about their strength of schedule and some red flags there defensively, I'll take a different approach on the offensive side of the ball and say that when you see Ole Miss basically shut it down last week against Tulsa, I'm not sure that was the best idea in a game that ends 35-27. Very similar approach week 1 against Troy.
Yep.
Do you feel Lane Kiffin, much like you alluded to with Oklahoma State, having games circled, knowing, look, we're not going to put our full playbook on display, and that may be the reason that Jackson Dart hasn't thrown the ball as much downfield, and we could see a very different-looking Ole Miss offense in their SEC opener?
You know, we could, but I haven't... I think some of the stats are a little surprising that, Dart's number 24 in total QBR. That's not what I've seen on tape. I mean, I can even go back to the spring game. I mean, there's been, in my opinion, some inconsistency there. And we've seen it, obviously, with the offensive performances, particularly later in games. I do think that you'll see an expanded playbook. I do think Kiffin has been a little conservative so far. The competition hasn't been great. And I think statistically, Kentucky's defense looks good. But I think there's going to be some opportunity here, especially when you dive deep into what Kentucky's faced so far this season. I mean, they played a backup quarterback in the second half against Miami, Ohio. That was a close game, and it completely changed in the final minute of the first half and the first 2 minutes of the second half, and then the quarterback gets hurt, Gabbert from Miami, Ohio. Anthony Richardson, even despite a good performance against Tennessee last week, leaves a lot to be desired for obvious reasons as a passer. They played an FCS team, and then they faced a backup quarterback for a majority of last week's game. Against Northern Illinois. So I do think there's some opportunity here for that Ole Miss offense to have one of their better performances of the season.
It's always interesting, and I don't mean to create this parallel. Payne yells at me all the time for it because it's not apples to apples. But when you think about these numbers in a greater context, that Ole Miss, the exact same number at home in Oxford, laying 6.5 that we saw Florida lay against Kentucky a couple short weeks ago. I don't think any of the three of us would put Ole Miss and Florida a pick 'em on a neutral field, but I don't want to speak out of turn. So it's interesting when you look at some of those dynamics and the way the market chooses to respond to all situations. I said we were going to Starkville. I jumped the gun a little bit. We are headed there now, where Mississippi State will welcome in Texas A&M. You're looking at Mississippi State, a 3.5-point favorite, pretty much painted across the board. Total in this game, 45. Haven't seen much total movement at all throughout the course of the week. You did see a number at 2.5, so you had a chance to lay slightly better if you wanted to back the favorite initially. Mississippi State, meanwhile, is looking to start 4-1 or better for the first time since 2014 when they started the season 5-0. And they're one bad quarter against LSU away from still being undefeated here. Meanwhile, Brad, Texas A&M comes into this game, and I describe them as a team sprinkled with fairy dust. If you dig into the box scores in their win over Arkansas, where they needed a missed field goal off the upright to win 23-21 that included a defensive touchdown that flipped that game on its head, and the game against Miami that looks worse by the week, winning 17-9, where they were outstatted where it mattered most. What have you done with Texas A&M, knowing that they're down one of their key playmakers for an offense that's already struggled this season to establish an identity?
Yeah, I've downgraded Texas A&M's power rating 3.5 points, and that might be conservative. I gotta look. The offense has been really bad so far, so. How much worse can it get? I know Anaya Smith is by far their best playmaker on the outside at the wide receiver position, but I guess I was a little conservative with the downgrade because, it's tough going from 1 to 0. That's as far as the offense goes. Look, the changing quarterback hasn't made that much of a difference. Max Johnson brings more stability and experience, but statistically, not much has changed. And you still got a guy in Jimbo Fisher that's calling plays like it's 15 years ago. So I don't have a lot of expectation, not only in this game, but moving forward with this Texas A&M offense this year. It's not going to be there. It's going to be well below average.
Yeah, the Aggies haven't scored more than 23 points in a game versus an FBS opponent. That of 23, of course, came with the aid of a defensive touchdown. When you look at A&M overall, it was interesting. Jimbo Fisher quoted this week, Payne, "We are by far not close to where we need to be," said Jimbo after the Aggies 23-21 win over Arkansas. "We beat two good football teams, though, not playing our best football." The floor is yours if you choose to defend Jimbo's Stone Age antics as it pertains to building an offensive game plan in the modern era of college football.
The Stone Age antics and what Jimbo likes to incessantly do on offense might actually work here. Standard down run rates are through the roof for A&M. Rushing rate over expectation is high. This is what Jimbo does. And you couple that with the fact of, their leading receiver, Anaya Smith, is out for the season. That's probably going to be Jimbo's approach again. And it's just like, a tiger that can't change his stripes. But you look at Mississippi State defensively. They run a 3-3-5. So by nature, again, light box. And the light box consists of smaller-bodied guys as well. Nathan Pickering's 285 pounds. Cameron Young at nose tackle is the biggest guy along that defensive line at 315. So far, Young's graded out just an average run defender this season. Jaden Crumity hasn't played. That was supposed to be their horse in the middle, their leading run stopper. He has not played yet, not going to play in this game. And then you look at who Mississippi State has played so far this season. Memphis, Arizona, Bowling Green, and LSU. The first three offenses I mentioned there have an average rushing EPA efficiency of 98. LSU, the final team I mentioned, is currently 9th in EPA per rush. That's the game Mississippi State lost. That's the game Mississippi State gave up 2.7 yards per rush before first contact and got bullied in the trenches. And that's not an elite LSU offensive line by any stretch. So I initially was looking Mississippi State when it opened, right? It was like 1 some places. And then we got out to 4.5, and I was like, this is just too much of a price to lay. And then before we started recording, someone felt the very same way, and we're now down to like soft 3.5. But I think if A&M is to go on the road and upset Mississippi State, it's got to be with what Jimbo and everything we've been clamoring him to change actually is able to do this week. They have to be able to run the ball. And the matchup would indicate they might have a chance doing that. If not, they're going to lose this game.
It's so wild because I think all of us look at things the same way. You dig into the box score, you try and figure out a team being overvalued, you circle spots, and the market smacks you in the face with a number here where you go, yeah, I'd have been happy to bet Mississippi State at Pick'em, but laying 3.5, a much different battle, and you go, maybe it's better just to live and fight another day. I think this game will go a long, long way, obviously, in determining the SEC West pecking order, where LSU is significantly better than they were early in the season. I think Texas A&M, to Brad's point early, has taken a full step back for the side a lot of people thought could be the biggest thorn in the side to Alabama's reign of dominance in this half of the draw. A&M may need to wait another year, but we'll find out on Saturday in Starkville which one of these teams is hell-bent on being a contender. Speaking of the Alabama Crimson Tide, final game that we have to break down on today's slate is against Arkansas in Fayetteville. A noon kickoff on CBS, and Alabama a massive favorite in this particular spot. 17.5-point road favorites. Total on this game at 61. It's going to be a red out in Fayetteville. Alabama players may or may not have had some snide comments about what Arkansas is trying to do to instill home field advantage there. Meanwhile, it's been one-way traffic. Alabama has won 15 straight versus Arkansas. Only 4 of Alabama's 15-game win streaks have been decided by fewer than 13 points. It does include last year, though, where Alabama won 42-35. Arkansas scoring 35 points against Alabama last year was the most they scored against Bama since 2007 when they lost 41-38, which marked the first game in this long losing streak. Despite winning by just 7 last year, though, Alabama outgained Arkansas by 200-plus yards, 671-468. Alabama's 671 total yards was the most against a ranked opponent in the Nick Saban era. Arkansas comes in a little bit deflated, knowing they let a glorious opportunity slip through their fingers to win in Jerry's World last week. Brad, when you look at these two football teams, is there anyone that's surprised you so far this season that you felt the need to upgrade, downgrade, or have Alabama and Arkansas kind of fit the profile you had for both of them coming into the season?
Yeah, both have so far fit pretty much the profile, which might be surprising to some because Alabama in their high-profile game, I disappointed greatly against Texas, could have easily lost that game outright. But, I mean, they have played 4 total games, and when you start diving into just simple metrics like when yards per play margin, yards per game margin, points per game margin, there's Alabama number 1 or number 2 in all those categories. And, I mean, a really dominant performance. I get it, Vanderbilt, but Vanderbilt is a little bit better this year, and that was a complete whitewash last week. With that being said, I will say, and I'm not sure if we'll get into this, but off the top of my head, the key factor for me is Alabama's struggles on the road the last year plus. I can't really, maybe offensive line issues, really pinpoint it, but it just has not looked like a typical Nick Saban coach team, particularly on the road, where they can't get margin. I mean, win by 2 against Florida, could have lost to A&M last year, won by 2 at Auburn, a game they could have another loss there, and then, they could have easily lost at Texas earlier this year. So this is something to keep an eye on for Alabama to see if they have improved maybe some of their communication with that vaunted red out, and that we'll see on Saturday afternoon.
I have to be careful, Brad. I can't say anything negative about Arkansas athletics. I don't think anybody that's a fan of the Razorbacks basketball program has forgiven me for a comment I made a couple of years ago, but hopefully we're able to patch things up going forward. Payne, when you look at this matchup, I mean, Brad highlighted some of Alabama's struggles that no doubt were on full display against Texas, and the biggest thing for me watching that game is that Alabama's receivers didn't find any ability to get separation against Texas' elite athletes in the secondary. Arkansas necessarily doesn't have that going for them, but they do have an offense that can try and beat you up physically, that's had some success running the ball. But will Arkansas be able to move the football and force Alabama out of its comfort zone?
So let's start with your first point there, and that's Alabama's offense, and we can kind of gravitate to the other side of the ball. And I think you hit it perfectly in that Texas felt great about their corner situation, and they played more man coverage, and we saw these Alabama receivers not showing ability to separate. The Razorbacks don't really have those kinds of dudes, but what's interesting here when you look at Alabama's receiving core, Burton is solid, but he's not the type of number 1 receiver that's come out of Alabama in recent years. You go back to 2020, it's Waddle and Smith. They're averaging 4.4 yards per route run. Last season, it was Jamison Williams, 3.2. This year, it's Ja'Cory Brooks and a running back in Jamar Gibbs that lead Alabama in yards per route run this season at roughly 2.3. There's just no juice deep. And the real concerning part about this is Alabama's faced 4 defenses with an average schedule adjusted efficiency rank of 85th to start the season. And this is where on paper you would like to attack Arkansas because they're susceptible through the air. Jalen Catalon's out for the year. Slusher missed 2 games. Bishop missed time. All told, Arkansas is outside the top 80 in EPA per pass allowed. Now, saw Miles Slusher return from injury last week against A&M. He performed awesome. He's easily Arkansas's best cover corner, so that's big. But Jimbo didn't have the aggressive bone in his body that we've grown accustomed to, so A&M ran the ball on 63% of first downs and 57% of third and longs. So they didn't really test Arkansas. But when he did, 72% adjusted accuracy, 72% adjusted completion rate for A&M last week. So the other element here is Arkansas is willing to give up the short stuff, which is what Alabama feels like they're comfortable doing through the air right now. The other thing that's clear from watching these games and looking at the metrics is Arkansas has changed their defensive scheme this season. They used to play this double cloud coverage, right, that they've used the past couple seasons, right, with 6 defensive backs. They're not doing that. You're seeing more 4- and 5-man fronts because of something we discussed in our preview podcast, and that was Arkansas's defensive line having serious question marks, especially on the interior. Once Torrin Carter tore his knee late in spring, it left Arkansas with only 3 scholarship defensive tackles. I think Bama has the ability to methodically move it against Arkansas, and they'll have success doing it if they don't turn it over or beat themselves with penalties like they did in the last road trip against Texas. But in this kind of like one-game setting, Arkansas did well holding A&M to 1.1 yards before first contact last week, but did give up 4.6 yards after contact because they couldn't tackle. And if you look at Arkansas in the season, 3.1 line yards per rush attempt they give up. They've only stuffed 14% of runs. You combine that with grading 126th out of 132 teams in tackling, and that's how you get an Arkansas defense barely inside the top 100 in EPA per rush allowed. So I think Young is going to have some help with the ground game here. I think stylistically he'll be able to pick apart the zone defenses. We kind of touched on this. Like, Young is substantially better against zone, and I think these receivers for Alabama are a little bit better against zone because they aren't the elite athletes that we've seen them have in previous iterations. Really, the only shot Arkansas has defensively, I think, is the environment you guys have mentioned, right? Hope the crowd assists and more Bama penalties. Hope you have positive turnover luck and you force Bama to go 9, 10, 12, 14 plays to score, and then pray Drew Sanders, the former 5-star Alabama linebacker that transferred in this offseason, is able to help identify some of Alabama's calls here.
Well, you mentioned it. It's been an Arkansas defense. It's been a lot of boom or bust. Anyone who watched that Cincinnati game way back in week 1 in its entirety saw opportunities for deep shots that the Bearcats were able to capitalize on, but they ended up shooting themselves in the foot. Last week, A&M, to your point, much more methodical instead of looking for the big play to try and take advantage there. Arkansas has been great creating havoc, but it also makes them vulnerable on the backside. Brad, when you look at the Arkansas offensive attack, KJ Jefferson, I've been widely critical of. I've questioned his abilities as a passer. He's probably been better than I anticipated through the first couple of games of the season. We've seen a couple of receivers emerge and transfer, specifically Jaden Hazelwood. Look at Matt Landers. Those guys are leading the charge here. Raheem Sanders has been their bell cow back. Do they have the pieces offensively to at least scare Alabama or put together methodical enough drives to give their defense a chance to rest if Alabama puts together those 9, 10, 11 play marches that Payne kind of mentioned they should be going about doing?
You know what? I have my doubts, but then I go back to last year's game, and KJ Jefferson, even last year, with some inefficiency in the pass game, was still able to be pretty productive against Alabama. And Alabama looked statistically as dominant as ever on the defensive side of the ball, but who have they faced? And we saw that first quarter and a half against Texas. Quinn Ewers, a relatively inexperienced quarterback with a lot of talent, but still was moving the football up and down the field, and there was some key drops there from Texas. Otherwise, there would have been more points on the board in that game. So I think I have my doubts, but I think more importantly, it's the frame of mind of KJ Jefferson. He can't let last week's big mistake cost him in this week's game. I mean, that was just an idiotic play at the goal line that ended up being one of the major key factors of why they lost last week. Gotta get that out of your head, because Alabama's the last team, if you're not dialed in on a play-in and play-out basis, that I want to play.
Payne, when you look at Alabama defensively, obviously Texas is probably the best data point when they had to step up in class, went on the road. You know, Brad mentioned the fact they look pretty pedestrian in a 2019 win. They've been dominant against inferior foes when you look at the defensive performance against Utah State, UL Monroe, and last week against the Vanderbilt team that we thought could move the football a little bit more and at least flirt with some offensive success. Has Alabama been what you thought they were going to be from a metric standpoint so far this season defensively?
To Brad's point, they really haven't played anybody other than Texas's offense, and then Ewers went down. But what you saw in that game was a little shocking, and maybe it was the wrong game plan, but there was a lot of one-on-one stuff outside for Alabama's defense where their corners were getting beat. Yep. And I kind of just like shook my head and said, this is stunning from Nick Saban. You have Quinn Ewers has been turning the ball over all camp, and we're just allowing the guy to have one read deep bomb throws all game long, as opposed to like playing zone and making him go through his progressions and making him read the defense and making him fit it into tight windows. So I do think this comes down to game plan a little bit. At this point, we know what Arkansas's offense is. It's very straightforward. They want to be able to run the ball and create the extra man advantage in the box with, you know, Jefferson's legs, and the goal is to run it well enough that Alabama or whoever they're playing is forced to bring another guy into the box. So then KJ Jefferson has that paint by numbers throw, which is just one-on-one outside. So far, Arkansas's O-line is getting push. 3.3 line yards per rush. They've only allowed 14% of runs to be stuffed. We nitpicked this offseason with our Bama defensive preview, and we said if there's like one area where I don't absolutely love the situation, it's on the interior. And then defensive tackle Byron Young left the Vandy game in a boot and on crutches. Fortunately, the guy we told you to monitor as the season goes along has actually hit the ground running. It's true freshman Jaheim Otis. He's 6'5", 370. He's Bama's best run-stopping interior lineman, but past him and DJ Dale this week, there's not a ton there. And, you know, through 4 games, stopping the run hasn't been an issue for Bama. They've played 3 poor offenses. And again, you know, the toughest test was against Texas. The Longhorns only averaged, get this, -1 yard before first contact. So Bama has dominated up front. Also something to keep your eye on here. Do it all. Bama safety Jordan Battle came up holding his hamstring late in the Vandy game. Let's see if he goes. He's a guy that plays down in the box at times and assists with the run game. Now, I went back and watched last year's game. I thought KJ Jefferson, you know, played this special game as a passer in last season's matchup. Nearly 22 predicted points added as a passer. But I went back and I watched this game. Treylon Burks was just a man out there. He was dominant. He was responsible for 17 of those 22 predicted points added by KJ Jefferson through the air. He's obviously gone. Receiver is a question mark for Arkansas this season. Arkansas also scored, if you go back to that game, they scored on a fake field goal, then got a touchdown with a minute to go, down multiple scores where Bama was playing prevent. I look at the Arkansas leading pass catchers this season. The 5 most targeted guys are Hazelwood, Landers, Knox, Thompson, and Raheem Sanders out of the backfield. Those 5 guys combined to average 1.7 yards per route run. I don't know if Arkansas has that guy to consistently win the one-on-one matchup outside this year.
Going to be one interesting game. Brad kind of mentioned some of Alabama's struggles on the road. On the surface, it looks like a big number, but if the X's and O's don't line up, it doesn't always make for the most attractive home underdog. Of course, Alabama, some bigger fish to fry as well coming up in the SEC West. We know what they have on deck in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's better spots down the line maybe to play Alabama than trying to figure out if you want to lay 18 in this kind of environment with an offense that doesn't seem to have the punch yet. And the kid that transferred in from Louisville, he's been picking splinters out of his ass. He can't get on the field. Now he's been dealing with a little bit of a hamstring injury. Let's see once he gets better if he's out there and provides that deep threat to Alabama. But it's tough to want to lay 18 on the road with an offense that just isn't overly explosive right now.
Oh, there's no doubt that they haven't shown an ability to run away and hide when they go out on the highway, at least recently. Everything is subject to change. We'll see if it actually manifests itself Saturday afternoon in Fayetteville, which should be an electric environment, where to both of your gentlemen's points, Arkansas needs to get out to a lead, force Alabama out of its comfort zone a little bit, especially if you're trying to get a rocking chair cover. Should you, excuse me, elect to back.
Man down.
You know, I may have to pump the brakes a little bit. Hold on, I can grab some water here. You know, you talk about picking splinters out of your ass. I may have to put myself on the 10-day IL.
There you go.
But Want to remind all of you, our loyal listeners, you can follow Brad on Twitter. That's at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well, at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me there, too. And most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Brad, before we let you go to enjoy the rest of your preparation for college football week 5, any other news, notes, or noteworthy nuggets you'd like to share with our listenership?
We do have breaking news on the social media front. Brad Powers has passed Payne already in Twitter followers. I didn't know if you guys were keeping track, but I know Payne's going to have, he has the immediate clap back and say, hey, talk to me when you pass me in bankroll, which is going to take a significant, much longer period. I'm just hoping Payne allows me to stay at one of his villas sometime. But I did pass you, Payne. I'm pretty excited about that. I want to make you aware of that. I'm not sure that you were.
I'm not a big Twitter guy. I need to be a little bit more active, but you're out and about. You're certainly more likable. So this doesn't surprise me.
That's for sure, Brad. You are 100% more likable than Payne. That
only when I win, guys. Only when I win.
I have to start tweeting more.
The one a day tweet approach from Payne. We could use a little bit more snark and cynicism coming from you on a regular basis, or the undressing of some undesirable folks on social media as it so requires. But best of luck, Brad, with all of your investments this weekend. Can't thank you enough for jumping into the fold each and every week throughout the course of college football season, and hope this Saturday, or Thursday, Friday, and Saturday are extremely profitable for you.
Thanks, guys.
Mr. Powers coming off the top ropes, Payne, taking shots at your social media acumen over there.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm a little bit more mature, a little bit more wiser these days, and I'm not going to take the bait. I know I'm a terrible tweeter. I know I'm very unlikable because I tell you your favorite teams stink every week, and I don't give free picks out on Twitter. But, it is what it is.
You are the voice of...
Glad to see his following growing.
You are the voice of reason around these parts. If people just wanted to hang out with people that told you what they wanted to hear, what fun would that be, right?
Yeah. I like it. I'm working on it. Working on the likability.
All right. We broke down a boatload of games. It was great to get Brad's take on USC. I know a topic that we started the top of the show with. Obviously, ran the full gamut of things. 7 breakdowns, 2 deep dives, 5 key factors of sorts, a non-Powers 5 game. But there still is one final order of business, and it's identifying where we think the best investment will lie for college football week 5.
You and I have gone back and forth on this a little bit, and typically there's multiple decisions, but I think we arrived at 2-1-3, the Troy Trojans plus the points. There's 5.5 out there. There's some easy access to 6. Let's go that way, and I know there's some interesting elements here just based upon what we've seen from Troy. A little bit better than the record indicates. Not completely sold on Western Kentucky with all that they've lost in the past few years. I think that we've seen Troy, like, what is this line if a Hail Mary doesn't transpire at Appalachian State? Now, obviously, that was a good spot for Troy. But just what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, I mean, just an impressive effort against Marshall last week, a team that went on the road and beat Notre Dame. I think they're better than their record indicates, and I think you pinpointed something that's extremely underlying here, so I won't take that from you, and I'll let you divulge.
Yeah, there's a unique storyline that emerges in this game, and it has to do with a transfer quarterback in Jared Dagey. Dagey competed in Bowling Green, Kentucky to be the Western Kentucky starting quarterback, ultimately lost the job to an FCS transfer in Austin Reed, but clearly when you go through camp, you know the offensive installation, you know what the play calling looks like, you know the cadence, and all of those other wrinkles that I think will serve Troy extremely well in devising a defensive game plan, because Payne, if you're setting up a scout team quarterback, who do I want to run the plays? The guy that ran the plays all during camp during the month of August. And this is a Troy defense, I think, that's underrated to your point. You look at how they were able to clamp down on an awful spot last week against Marshall, having had their guts ripped out the week before. Meanwhile, you dig into Western Kentucky, and while the numbers are good from an ATS standpoint, they're 3-1. They're 3-1 straight up. Strength of schedule, for me, leaves a lot to be desired. Austin Peay at Hawaii, which looks worse and worse by the week, at Indiana, versus FIU. 2 of their 4 wins have come against teams that I have power rated in the bottom 4 in the entire football bowl subdivision. Western Kentucky offensively can be dynamic, but this will be their biggest test defensively by a ton. And anytime you're going to give me the better defense catching this many points, I think there's ample opportunity not just for Troy to cover this game, but to win outright if Gunnar Watson makes good decisions leading this Trojans offense.
I think that's the element here, right? Just perception. And I understand, right? Troy and Western Kentucky line makers aren't putting a ton of perception in the line. But when you go out and win 73-0 and you've had a nice little G5 brand, and then Troy goes out there and, loses on a Hail Mary to App State, I think as handicappers, we know they deserve that win. But in the record, right, just 2-2. So I think this is not just a good matchup. We uncovered something that was underlying with Jared Dagey that I think most odds makers are not factoring into this number. And when I look at this, I just think this is a good spot for Troy. And I think they could be the better team. I really do. Like, it doesn't impress me that you went out there and beat up on FIU, the worst team in the country last week. So I think we're getting some value there in the number with Troy. I think 6 minus 15 is probably the number to call this for grading purposes. And let's go with that. Rotation number 2 and 3, Troy, plus 6 minus 15.
Better conference as well. I think the Sun Belt, when you look at the pecking order of the group of 5 conferences, the Sun Belt may be the top of the heap, especially compared to Conference USA, and you look elsewhere in the landscape. So sometimes you go big game hunting like we did last weekend, fading a top 10 team. Sometimes you do a little dumpster diving to try and find that diamond in the rough. Troy Trojans, your best bet. Any final words of wisdom, parting shots, a scale of 1 to 10 for how nervous you'll be for kickoff Saturday when your boys welcome in the Demon Deacons?
I'm a little nervous there, but kind of going back to prior to the best bet, I think what you and I should do, and because you have the largest following and because you have a little bit more ties to the corporate world.
Oh, God, I'm not
Kim
sure.
Kardashian is on the open market. She is fielding some dating suggestions. Maybe we get Brad a date with Kim K, since we know he's very hyped about his following these days.
You know what? I think it'd be entertaining if we could be a fly on the wall or videotape what that potential drinks or dinner would be. I think that video has all the viral potential in the world, and it'd be the biggest thing, especially if we get that little bet the board watermark somewhere on there. Oh, we become a household brand, not just for sports bettors, but for lifestyle enthusiasts.
Yes. And Brad's following would just shoot through the roof. We see what Pete Davidson's following did. I think we got to set Brad up with a date for Kim K now that she is single, and she claims not ready to mingle, but she's never met the wrath of a sports bettor before. So she may be...
I can't wait for Brad to have a chance to defend himself next week since he's not on the show with us right now. It's great when you can take shots at someone who's not here to say one thing or another. So Brad, when you're out there listening, this will be the first topic of discussion when we ask you how your date with Kim Kardashian went next week. All right. On that note, you can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Special thanks to Brad Powers, who's been with us all season long and will continue to be breaking down the biggest games in the college football landscape. And with a Troy Trojans ticket in hand come Saturday evening, we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.